A sudden collision of worlds. The day Nathan Reed stepped into Cozy Cafe with his girlfriend Sophie Turner, he had no idea that his life was about to be irreversibly changed. The familiar warmth of the cafe, the fragrant aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the sound of soft conversations filled the air. But for Nathan, this quiet retreat from the chaos of his billion-dollar empire was short-lived. He had always been a man defined by his ambition, a relentless pursuit of success that left little room for anything else. Sophie, with her sparkling eyes and laughter, was his perfect match in a world of wealth and glamour. The two made their way to an empty table near the window, the golden rays of the sun catching Sophie's hair as she laughed at one of Nathan's usual sarcastic remarks. As Nathan sat down and relaxed, feeling the weight of the world lift off his shoulders for a moment, he couldn't help but notice the cozy ambience of the place. The wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and the steady clink of porcelain cups seemed so different from the high-rise offices and lavish meetings he was accustomed to. It was almost refreshing, a brief respite from the demands of being a self-made millionaire. But all of that peace shattered when his gaze drifted to the counter. Behind the coffee machine, wiping down a counter in a hurried, almost robotic motion, was someone Nathan had never expected to see in such a place, his ex-wife, Isabella Morgan. The sight hit him like a cold wave. His breath caught in his throat as recognition spread through him like wildfire. There she was, visibly pregnant, her once meticulously maintained appearance now replaced with the tired, weary look of someone who had been working far too hard for far too long. The oversized apron she wore couldn't hide the curve of her belly, and her eyes, once warm and full of life, now held a guarded, distant look. For a moment, time stood still. The soft hum of conversation around him faded, and Nathan's thoughts spiraled into a chaotic storm of questions and confusion. How had things ended up like this? How had he missed all the signs? Was this child his? The weight of the unanswered questions pressed down on him like a leaden cloak. He felt his pulse quicken, his hand trembling slightly as it gripped the cup in front of him. Sophie, engrossed in her phone, didn't notice his sudden shift in demeanor, but Nathan couldn't take his eyes off Isabella. Her movements were efficient, practiced, yet, beneath the surface, there was a deep wariness in the way she moved, in the way she avoided his gaze when their eyes momentarily met. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. He had been so wrapped up in his work, in his constant chase for more success, that he had failed to see how much Isabella was suffering. He had abandoned her. And now, here she was, pregnant, working as a waitress in a small cafe. The guilt twisted in his stomach, gnawing at him. Sophie's voice barely reached him as she chatted, oblivious to the storm that was brewing inside Nathan. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, memories from their time together. The late nights, the hollow arguments, the growing distance between them. Before he could make sense of it all, something inside him snapped. He stood up abruptly, muttering something to Sophie, who didn't even notice as he left the table. His feet moved instinctively toward the counter, his eyes locked on Isabella, who was now wiping the counter with a force that suggested she was trying to scrub away any trace of their past. Isabella glanced up, her eyes cold and distant, her lips set in a tight, emotionless line. "Can I help you?" Her voice was sharp, though her tone remained professional. Nathan's heart sank as the words caught in his throat. He had so much he wanted to say, to ask about the child, to apologize for everything he had done, or rather, everything he hadn't done. But all that came out was a strained Isabella. She didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the brokenness in his voice. Instead, she raised an eyebrow and turned away, calling out the next order to the kitchen, as though he didn't exist. The weight of her indifference hit him harder than anything else. She had built walls around herself, walls Nathan knew he could never tear down with his money, his words, or his usual charm. She had moved on. She had built a life without him. And yet, despite the icy cold reception, Nathan couldn't walk away. Not this time. He sat back down at his table, feeling the guilt and regret pile up like a crushing weight. Sophie continued to chatter, but Nathan's mind was no longer present. His eyes followed Isabella as she worked, her movements mechanical, her tired eyes betraying the exhaustion she couldn't hide. It was clear to him now. Isabella wasn't just surviving. She was fighting. And Nathan had never been there when she needed him the most. As the minutes stretched on, Nathan knew that he couldn't simply walk away. He couldn't leave things like this. There was too much left unsaid, too many questions that needed answering. He had failed her once, but maybe, just maybe, he could try to make it right. Confronting the past. The air inside the cafe seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. The once inviting warmth now felt suffocating, thick with unspoken tension. Nathan sat at his table, his coffee growing cold in front of him, untouched. Sophie had fallen into a rhythm, scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the storm that raged inside Nathan. But his mind was far from the peaceful bubble of their shared laughter and idle chatter. It was consumed with the sight of Isabella, pregnant, working, and carrying a burden that he had failed to even acknowledge. The room felt far away as Nathan's gaze remained fixed on her. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important, something monumental in their past. She had always been so patient, so understanding of his drive. But he had been too blind to see the cracks in their marriage, too absorbed in the chase for success to notice the woman he once loved slipping away. Nathan's mind rewound to the years they had spent together, to their shared life in the penthouse high above the city, where the view of the skyline had been as intoxicating as the promises they had made to each other. But somewhere along the way, those promises had become hollow. They had faded beneath the weight of his ambition and her growing discontent. The last argument they had, he couldn't forget it. It had been in their marble-floored living room, the city lights twinkling in the distance. Isabella had stood there, her voice soft but laced with hurt. "You're always gone, Nathan. You're physically here, but you're never truly present. I need you to be with me, not just beside me." But instead of listening, Nathan had brushed her off. He had told himself that he was providing for their future, that all his hard work would eventually pay off. He never realized that what Isabella needed wasn't the luxury of their penthouse or the expensive vacations they'd once taken. She needed him, his time, his attention, his love. But he had been too wrapped up in climbing higher, reaching further. And now she was pregnant, alone, and exhausted, working as a waitress in a cafe. The bitterness of guilt burned in Nathan's chest. The weight of his absence was crushing. He had been so focused on making deals, winning contracts, and building his empire that he hadn't realized how deeply he was hurting the person who had stood by him through it all. A sharp voice pulled him back to the present. "Nathan, are you all right?" Sophie's concerned gaze locked onto him, her brows furrowed in confusion. Nathan managed to force a smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said quickly. "Just tired from work, you know." Sophie nodded, her attention returning to her phone, unaware of the chaos inside him. Nathan's hands gripped the edge of the table, the pressure in his chest intensifying. He needed to do something. He couldn't just sit there, pretending that everything was fine. Isabella deserved answers, and so did he. His eyes flickered to her again. Isabella was now standing behind the counter, taking an order from a regular customer, but her movements lacked the spark he remembered. She seemed drained, a shadow of the vibrant woman he had once known. The baby's subtle curve was more pronounced now, and with each passing moment, it seemed to press more heavily on Nathan's conscience. He had no idea how to approach her, no idea what to say. But there was one thing he knew for certain. He couldn't leave without at least trying to make things right. The decision hit him like a jolt of electricity. He couldn't fix everything, but maybe, just maybe, he could start by understanding what had happened, by apologizing for his absence, for the way he had hurt her. But he needed to talk to her first. Without a word to Sophie, Nathan stood up, his chair scraping noisily against the floor. His legs felt heavy, as though the weight of the past was anchoring him to the spot. But he didn't stop. Every step he took toward the counter felt like a battle. As he approached, Isabella didn't look up. Her focus remained solely on her task, wiping the counter, organizing cups, moving like someone who had long ago given up on the hope that things would change. But Nathan couldn't stop now. He couldn't back down. He needed to know why. He needed to know how things had gotten this far without him realizing. He stopped just a few feet away from the counter, taking a deep breath. His voice was barely a whisper. "Isabella." She froze at the sound of his voice, but she didn't turn to face him. Her shoulders stiffened, and for a moment, Nathan wondered if she had heard him at all. Then, slowly, she placed the rag down on the counter and faced him. Her eyes were cold, distant, a perfect reflection of the walls she had built around herself. "Yes?" she asked, her voice polite, but sharp. Nathan's heart dropped. Her tone cut deeper than he expected. He thought he would find some warmth, some semblance of the woman he had once known, but all he found was ice. The woman standing before him wasn't the same person he had shared a life with. She had become a stranger. His voice faltered as he tried to find the right words, but they escaped him. "I don't know what to say. I didn't know. I didn't know about the baby. I didn't know you were struggling like this." Isabella's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line. "You didn't know," she repeated, her voice low but filled with incredulity. "You didn't know. Nathan, you were never there. You were always too busy with your deals, your meetings, your success. I had to carry everything on my own. And now you want to come in here, act like you care, ask me about the baby." Her words stung, each one landing with the precision of a dagger. Nathan opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He could feel the shame wash over him, the suffocating guilt clawing at him. He had no defense, no excuse for his absence, for the way he had neglected her. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I can't undo the past. But I'm here now. I want to help." Isabella's laugh was bitter, a hollow sound that echoed in the empty space between them. "Help," she spat. "You think you can help by throwing money at me. You think that's going to fix everything." Nathan flinched at her words. They hit him like a slap in the face. She was right. He had been so focused on his success that he thought money could solve everything. But it couldn't. Not now. Not with the mess he had made of their lives. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm just asking for a chance to show you that I can do better. I can be present. I can be here for you and the baby." Isabella's eyes searched his face, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, her gaze unwavering. Then she looked away, picking up another order slip and silently turning to the kitchen. Nathan stood there, rooted to the spot. Her rejection felt like a heavy weight on his chest. He had expected anger, but not this level of coldness. He wasn't sure what he had hoped for, but this wasn't it. As the minutes passed, Nathan realized that he couldn't just stand there, waiting for something to happen. He had already lost so much, but he wasn't going to lose this chance too. He had to prove to her, and to himself, that he could change. But how? How could he bridge this gap? How could he make up for everything he had missed? He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to give up. Not this time. A path to redemption. Nathan had never been one to shy away from challenges. Whether in the corporate world or his personal life, he had always approached problems with the same laser-focused determination. But standing in that cafe, facing Isabella's icy indifference, he realized he had no blueprint for this. This was not a business deal. This was not a negotiation he could win with charm, money, or strategy. This was something far more fragile and complicated. Human emotions, trust, and the irreversible damage caused by years of neglect. After their brief and painful exchange, Nathan left the cafe, his mind consumed by the weight of Isabella's words. "You were never there." They echoed in his head, reverberating against the walls of his conscience like a constant drumbeat. It was a simple statement, but it cut through him with the force of 1,000 truths. She was right. He had been physically present, but emotionally absent. He had poured everything into building his empire, leaving behind the very person who had once been his closest confidant. As he drove back to his penthouse, the glittering skyline of the city before him seemed like a distant dream, as hollow and empty as his corporate victories. Sophie sat beside him, talking animatedly about an upcoming gala, but Nathan barely heard her. His thoughts were still with Isabella. Her cold reception, her guarded demeanor, and the painful reality of the life she had built without him. He hadn't just missed the signs, he had ignored them. The late nights when she had waited for him, the quiet dinners when he had been too busy with work to notice her growing distance. How had he let it get this far? How had he failed her so completely? Nathan's hands gripped the steering wheel, the leather creaking under the pressure. He didn't know how to fix this, but he knew that he had to try. Sophie's voice broke through his thoughts again, this time with a more pointed question. "Nathan, are you sure you're okay? You've been really off today. You didn't even seem interested in the meeting earlier." Nathan forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just a bit distracted. Too much on my mind." Sophie gave him a skeptical look but didn't press further. She had always been good at sensing when something was off, but she didn't seem to understand the depth of his turmoil. She was a part of his world now, a world where appearances mattered, where everything was polished and controlled. But this wasn't about appearances anymore. This wasn't about Sophie or the success he had built. This was about Isabella, the woman who had once been everything to him. That night, Nathan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his king-sized bed, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. He thought about calling Isabella, but he knew that would be a mistake. She didn't want him near her, didn't want anything from him, and he couldn't blame her for that. He had failed her in ways too many to count. But then he thought of something else, something that had been planted in his mind the moment he had stepped into that cafe. He couldn't just fix things with words. He couldn't make up for the years he had spent chasing something that didn't matter. But he could show Isabella that he was willing to change, that he was willing to be there for her, not just for himself, but because he had finally understood what was truly important. The next morning, Nathan woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to win her back with grand gestures or offers of money. He wasn't going to fix everything overnight. But he could start small. He could show up. He could be present. With that resolve in mind, Nathan drove to the cafe the next day without any expectations. He wasn't going to confront Isabella, wasn't going to apologize again. He had learned that words had little power without action to back them up. Instead, he simply sat down at a table, ordered a coffee, and watched her from afar. Isabella was behind the counter again, her face a mask of professionalism, but Nathan could see the exhaustion in the way she moved, the way she clutched her lower back after carrying a heavy tray, the way she absent-mindedly rubbed her belly, as though trying to comfort the child within. She was pregnant, yes, but she was also struggling, and Nathan had been blind to all of it. As the hours passed, Nathan remained in the cafe, not saying a word to Isabella. He didn't approach her, didn't ask about her life, didn't offer help. He just sat there, letting his presence speak louder than any words he could muster. And over time, he began to notice small shifts. A slight softening in Isabella's eyes when their gazes met briefly across the room. A brief, unspoken acknowledgement when she saw him sitting there, like she was beginning to understand that he wasn't there to make excuses. He wasn't there to fix anything. He was just there. This, Nathan realized, was the beginning. He had no idea where it would lead or how long it would take, but he was willing to wait. He was willing to show up, even if that meant sitting silently, letting her process, letting her make the decisions. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about Isabella and the life they had once built together. For the next few days, Nathan continued his quiet vigil at the cafe. He didn't approach her. He didn't try to engage in any conversations. He simply sat there, ordering his coffee, reading his papers, or just lost in his thoughts. Each day, Isabella seemed to become just a little less distant, her movements a little less mechanical, her gaze a little softer when she glanced at him. It wasn't much, but it was something. Sophie noticed the change, of course. She began to ask questions, but Nathan brushed her off with vague answers. He knew Sophie was important to him, but he also knew that what was happening with Isabella, this fragile, tentative thread of connection, was something he needed to focus on. He had never been good at balancing relationships, but he was willing to learn, willing to put in the work this time, no matter how hard it might be. One evening, as the cafe was winding down, and Isabella was getting ready to close up for the night, Nathan made a decision. He wasn't going to wait forever. He wasn't going to push her, but he was going to take a step forward. He stood up from his table, walking slowly towards the counter. Isabella was washing dishes, her back turned to him, but Nathan knew this was his moment. This time, he wouldn't just sit and wait. He wouldn't just observe from a distance. He was ready to take responsibility for the damage he had caused. "Isabella," he said, his voice steady but softer than it had ever been before. She froze, not turning to face him. The sound of running water filled the silence between them. "I'm not here to make excuses," Nathan continued. "I'm not here to fix everything with money or grand gestures. But I am here. I'm here to show you that I can do better. I can be there for you and the baby, if you'll let me." For a long moment, there was no response. The tension hung thick in the air, and Nathan could feel the weight of Isabella's silence pressing down on him. He had no idea what would happen next, but he wasn't going to walk away this time. Finally, Isabella turned to face him, her expression unreadable. She met his eyes, and for the briefest of moments, Nathan saw something there, something that wasn't anger, wasn't contempt, but the faintest trace of something else. A flicker of hope, perhaps, or maybe it was simply the recognition that he was trying in a way he never had before. "I'm tired, Nathan," she said quietly, her voice raw. "I'm so tired." "I know," Nathan whispered, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "But I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in a long time, Nathan felt like maybe, just maybe, he was starting to do something right. The weight of unspoken words. The days following Nathan's quiet confession in the cafe were a whirlwind of emotions. Each moment felt like a delicate balance. Too much, too soon, could push Isabella further away. But too little would risk erasing the fragile bridge he had begun to build. He had shown up, yes, but that was just the beginning. Now came the harder part, proving, through actions, that he wasn't the same man who had walked away all those years ago. As he continued to visit the cafe, sitting quietly at a corner table, he noticed the small changes in Isabella's demeanor. Her eyes softened when their gazes met, though she never approached him. There were moments when he would catch her watching him, and for a brief second, she would lower her gaze as though caught off guard. Nathan knew it wasn't forgiveness, at least not yet, but it was something. A small crack in the wall she had built around herself. On the third day of his quiet vigil, Nathan noticed something new. Isabella had come in early, wiping down tables with an almost mechanical precision, her apron still untied. The cafe was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around, sipping their coffee in the soft morning light. Nathan saw the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, her hands moving quickly to set up the counter. It was as though she was bracing herself for something. "Isabella," Nathan called softly as she passed by his table, her eyes focused on the task at hand. She froze for a second, then slowly turned her head to meet his eyes. The look in her gaze was guarded, distant, as though she was preparing for another confrontation. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice clipped but not unkind. "No," Nathan said, his voice soft but firm. "I just wanted to ask how you're doing, how the pregnancy's going." Isabella hesitated for a moment, then lowered her eyes, as though the question had caught her off guard. "It's fine," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It's just a lot. I don't have time to rest." Nathan felt his heart tighten at the exhaustion in her words. The weight of everything she was carrying, physically, emotionally, was too much for one person to bear alone. He had failed her before, but he wouldn't fail her again. "I can help," Nathan said quietly. "I'm not here to fix everything, Isabella. I just want to help however I can. You shouldn't have to do this by yourself." She raised her eyes to meet his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in them. Surprise, maybe. Maybe even a trace of hope. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by the familiar guardedness. "I don't need your help, Nathan," she said, the words sharp but not cruel. "I'm fine. I can handle it." Nathan nodded, not pushing her further. He knew better than to force her into accepting help. He understood the pride that came with wanting to do things on your own, especially when trust had been broken. But he wasn't going anywhere. He wouldn't push her, but he would be there. As she turned away, going back to her duties, Nathan sat in silence, watching her. Every move she made seemed to tell a story of exhaustion, resilience, and quiet strength. She was struggling, but she was surviving, and Nathan couldn't help but admire her for that. Over the next few days, Nathan's routine remained the same. He came to the cafe each morning, ordered his coffee, and sat at his table, his eyes often on Isabella as she worked. He didn't engage her directly, but he remained a constant presence in the cafe. He noticed the little things, the way she rubbed her lower back after long shifts, the way she checked on the customers with a tired smile, and the way her eyes flickered briefly in his direction whenever she passed by. But one morning, things changed. Isabella didn't show up for her shift. Nathan arrived at the cafe just as the door opened, but he didn't see her behind the counter. Instead, it was another young woman, one of the baristas he had seen occasionally, but Isabella was nowhere in sight. The cafe was quieter than usual, and the lack of her presence was palpable. Nathan's heart sank as he approached the counter. He had no right to ask about her, but he couldn't shake the worry that gnawed at him. He had become accustomed to seeing her every day, and the sudden absence felt like an empty space in the room. "Is Isabella okay?" he asked gently, his voice betraying the concern he hadn't realized he felt so strongly. The young barista glanced at him, a bit taken aback by the question. "She wasn't feeling well. Took the day off," she replied, her voice apologetic. Nathan nodded, feeling the familiar pang of helplessness. It wasn't the first time Isabella had seemed unwell, but this was different. She wasn't at work. She had taken time off, something that felt like a warning sign to him. That afternoon, Nathan couldn't shake the thought of Isabella alone in her apartment, possibly struggling with her pregnancy and the demands of work. He had seen her exhaustion firsthand, but it was becoming increasingly clear that she wasn't asking for help, and that, in its own way, was even more heartbreaking. Without much thought, Nathan found himself walking toward her apartment building. His footsteps were heavy with the weight of the decision he was making. He wasn't sure what he hoped to accomplish, but he knew he couldn't wait any longer. As he stood outside her building, the city lights flickering in the distance, he took a deep breath and dialed her number. His heart pounded in his chest as the phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. When Isabella's voice finally answered, it was soft, almost hesitant. "Nathan." "Isabella," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I know you're probably tired of hearing from me, but I need to ask if you're okay. I'm not trying to push you. I'm fine," she interrupted, her voice quiet but tired. "I don't need anything from you." Nathan's heart dropped at the words. He could hear the exhaustion, the frustration in her voice, and it made him ache. He wanted to tell her he understood, that he wasn't expecting anything from her, that he just wanted to help. "Isabella, please," he said softly, "let me help. I don't care if you don't need anything. I don't want you to do this alone. I can't change the past, but I can be here now. For you and the baby. Just let me be here." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Nathan could almost hear her breathing, the hesitation, the uncertainty. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Fine," she said, and the word felt like a fragile lifeline. "But I'm not doing this because I forgive you, Nathan. I'm doing it because I need help. But this doesn't change anything." Nathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something. It was the first step, and he wasn't going to waste it. "I understand," he said quietly. "I'm here, Isabella. Just tell me what you need." And with that, a new chapter began. Not one of grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but one of quiet understanding, presence, and patience. Nathan knew the road ahead would be long, and there would be many hurdles to overcome. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was finally on the right path. Small steps, fragile trust. The days following Nathan's hesitant step into Isabella's life were filled with quiet moments of learning. The path he had chosen wasn't one paved with grand gestures or dramatic breakthroughs. It was a slow, unsteady walk towards something fragile, something that could easily be shattered if he moved too fast. But Nathan knew now that he couldn't rush her. He couldn't rush trust, especially after years of neglect. Each day, he found himself returning to the cafe, not with the expectation of solving everything, but with the hope of being present, of showing her that he was no longer the man he had been before. He had been blinded by ambition in the past, by the desire for success at all costs. But now, he was trying to learn what it meant to put someone else first, to put Isabella first. Isabella had agreed to let him help, though her words still stung with caution. It was clear she wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. But that didn't stop him from doing whatever he could, quietly, unobtrusively. He started by picking up groceries for her. Nothing extravagant, just the basics she needed to get by. The first time he dropped them off at her apartment, he left the bags by her door, an anonymous gesture that required no interaction. He didn't need her gratitude, but the faint flicker of surprise in her eyes when she opened the door was enough for him to know that she had seen it. But there was no acknowledgement, no thank you. She simply nodded, closing the door after a brief silent exchange. Nathan didn't mind. He didn't need her to say anything. He was learning patience in ways he never had before. Days stretched into weeks, and the small, subtle steps Nathan took began to add up. He kept showing up at the cafe, kept buying coffee without demanding conversation, just to let Isabella know that he was there. He noticed the slight shifts in her behavior, how she seemed to relax a little when he was around, how she didn't stiffen so much when their eyes met. It was the beginning of something, though he didn't yet know what. One afternoon, as Nathan sat at his usual table, he noticed something unusual. Isabella had come in early again, but today, her posture was different. She wasn't standing behind the counter with her usual brisk professionalism. Instead, she was sitting in a corner booth, her head resting against her hand, looking drained and defeated. Nathan's heart ached at the sight. He had seen her tired before, but this was different. There was a heaviness in her demeanor, a quiet sorrow, that seemed to weigh her down more than just the physical strain of pregnancy. He watched for a moment, wondering if he should do something, anything. He wasn't sure if he had the right to approach her. After all, he had no idea what kind of help she needed. But something inside him told him that he couldn't just sit idly by. He couldn't pretend that everything was fine when he knew it wasn't. With a deep breath, Nathan stood up and walked over to her table. Isabella didn't seem to notice him at first, lost in her thoughts, but when he reached the booth, she looked up, her expression wary. "Nathan," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of surprise, but not the coldness it once held. "What are you doing here?" Nathan hesitated, unsure how to proceed. "I saw you sitting here, and I thought you might need a break. You look exhausted." Isabella's eyes softened for just a moment before she turned away, staring out the window. "I'm fine," she said, her words hollow. I don't have the luxury of resting, Nathan. I have a job to do, and a baby to take care of. I don't have time to be tired." Nathan sat down across from her, not asking for permission, but simply taking a seat. He wasn't going to let her push him away. Not this time. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice steady. "You don't have to do this all by yourself. You're carrying a lot, and you shouldn't have to carry it all alone." She laughed bitterly, the sound cold and sharp. "I don't need your pity, Nathan. You think just because you show up now, everything will be fine. You think I'm going to forgive you for what you did." Nathan winced at her words, but he didn't flinch. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even expect you to trust me. But I want to help. I know I can't undo the past, but I can show you that I'm here now. And I'll keep showing up, even if you don't want me to." For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. Her gaze was distant, focused on something outside the window that Nathan couldn't see. But he didn't push her. He simply sat there, patient, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she sighed, a heavy, exhausted sound. "I don't know how to do this, Nathan," she murmured. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm not asking for help. But sometimes I wish I wasn't so alone in this." Nathan's heart twisted in his chest. He knew she wasn't just talking about the pregnancy. She was talking about everything. The years of feeling abandoned, the weight of carrying it all on her own, the emptiness of having no one to lean on. He could feel the layers of pain that she had buried beneath the walls she had built, and for the first time, he truly understood. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice low but sincere. "I failed you. I know I can't change what I did, but I can try to make up for it. I won't abandon you again, Isabella. Not now. Not ever." She met his eyes for the first time in weeks, and for a fleeting moment, Nathan saw something in her gaze, something more than just hurt, something more than just bitterness. There was vulnerability there, and perhaps even a small flicker of hope. But before she could say anything, the cafe bell jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer, and Isabella quickly stood up, her mask of professionalism slipping back into place. "Thank you for the coffee, Nathan," she said quietly, avoiding his gaze. "But I have to work." Nathan nodded, standing up as well. "I understand," he said, his voice gentle. "I'll be here when you need me." He left the cafe, his heart heavy with the weight of their conversation. It wasn't the breakthrough he had hoped for, but it was progress. It was the first time she had truly let him in, even if it was just a crack. And that, Nathan realized, was all he could ask for. As the days turned into weeks, Nathan kept his promise. He continued to show up, to help in the small ways he could, whether it was picking up groceries, offering to drive her home, or simply sitting with her in silence when she needed someone. Slowly, the walls between them began to soften, but Nathan knew that trust was fragile, and it would take time to rebuild what had been broken. And yet, for the first time in years, Nathan felt like he was on the right path. He wasn't rushing it, wasn't forcing anything. He was simply there, willing to be patient, to wait for Isabella to meet him halfway. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he moved forward. And with each small step, he was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something together. The complexity of healing. The weeks that followed Nathan's decision to show up, day after day, were both the longest and shortest of his life. The time seemed to stretch on, but within that span, he found himself changing in ways he hadn't anticipated. The idea of just being present, of not rushing to fix things or to make amends with grand gestures, had begun to seep into his very being. And with it came a quiet understanding that healing, true healing, was not something that could be forced. It wasn't a quick fix. It was a process. It was mid-afternoon when Nathan walked into Cozy Cafe again, a usual presence by now, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't have the urgency he once carried, always racing from one meeting to the next, consumed by deadlines and deals. Now there was only the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the clock as he settled into his corner, his coffee cup still warm in his hands, his mind both at peace and restless. Isabella was there today, as usual, but she was different. The exhaustion that had weighed her down before seemed to have deepened, her movements still efficient but tinged with a quiet weariness. She wasn't the same vibrant woman he remembered, and perhaps that was the point. She had transformed, evolved into someone stronger, but also more guarded. Nathan watched her from his corner, not approaching, not demanding attention, but just observing. He had come to realize that the way forward was through the smallest, most mundane things. It wasn't about forceful apologies or attempts to explain himself. It was about showing her that he could be reliable in ways he hadn't been before. He could sit in silence, share a coffee, and simply be. And yet, despite his newfound understanding, his heart still ached. He had been there for her, yes, but there was still so much left unsaid. So many things they had both buried under the weight of time and hurt. He knew there were layers to this, layers that neither of them could rush through, no matter how much Nathan wanted to take away her pain. Today, Isabella seemed different. She moved behind the counter as usual, but there was a tension in her posture. Her smile, though polite, didn't reach her eyes. And when she glanced at Nathan, there was something unreadable in her expression, something that hinted at uncertainty, perhaps even fear. He had seen that before, in the early days of their marriage, when the weight of their unresolved issues loomed over every conversation. But now it was different. The fear wasn't of him. It was of herself, of how much of herself she had been forced to bury over the years. Nathan took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He didn't have an agenda today. There was no need to talk about the past or ask for forgiveness. He had learned that sometimes words were the least effective way of bridging the gap. Instead, he stood and walked toward the counter. Isabella didn't immediately acknowledge him, but Nathan wasn't bothered. She was in her own world, dealing with the pressure of work, her own private battles that he could never fully understand. It wasn't until he was standing just a few feet from her that she finally looked up. "Oh," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "Nathan, what can I get you today?" Her words were formal, polite, but the edge of discomfort was unmistakable. She didn't smile. She didn't meet his gaze directly, but her eyes flickered briefly to his face before quickly shifting away. Nathan hesitated, unsure of what to say, but then he decided to simply keep it casual, just as he had been trying to do. "Same as usual," he said, a small, easy smile crossing his lips. "Just a coffee. Thanks." Isabella nodded, moving to prepare his order without a word. Nathan watched her as she worked, noticing the way she avoided his gaze. But there was also something else, something more subtle. She wasn't shutting him out completely. She wasn't being cold. She was just guarding herself. And Nathan could understand that. He had spent years building walls around himself, walls that had kept him from seeing the damage he had caused. As she handed him the cup of coffee, their fingers brushed lightly. It wasn't intentional, at least not on her part, but it was enough to send a shiver down Nathan's spine. He could feel the warmth of her touch, the tension in the air between them, but for once, he didn't feel the need to say anything. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was just a space between them that neither one of them had to fill. "Thanks," Nathan said, his voice quiet. Isabella gave him a brief, tight-lipped smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. She looked away quickly, turning her attention to another customer who had just walked in. Nathan didn't linger. He returned to his seat, sipping his coffee, but his thoughts were elsewhere, on Isabella, on how she had changed, on the silent walls she had built to protect herself. He didn't blame her for that. He had been the one who had contributed to their crumbling marriage, the one who had made her feel like she couldn't rely on him. But what could he do now? Nathan was no longer the man who could solve everything with a checkbook or a well-timed speech. He wasn't sure what the future held for them, if anything at all. But he knew one thing. He wasn't giving up. He would keep showing up. He would keep being there for her, even if she never fully let him in again. Later that evening, as the cafe began to empty out, Nathan found himself standing by the door, preparing to leave. But as he reached for the handle, Isabella's voice stopped him. "Wait." He turned to find her standing by the counter, her expression unreadable. For the first time in a while, she didn't look exhausted. She didn't look angry or distant. She looked uncertain. Nathan's heart quickened. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, though he had no idea what it would bring. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. There was no anger, no bitterness, just an invitation, an opening. Nathan nodded, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "Of course. Whatever you need." She led him to a small table in the back of the cafe, far from the noise and bustle of the remaining customers. The space felt intimate, almost private. And for a moment, they both sat in silence, neither of them knowing exactly where to begin. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice hesitant. "I've been thinking about what you said, about being here, about trying to help." She paused, her eyes shifting nervously. "And I don't know if I'm ready to trust you again, Nathan. But I'm not as angry as I was. I think I can start to see that you're trying. And that counts for something." Nathan's breath caught in his throat. For all the years of mistakes and missteps, for all the time they had lost, it was this small step forward, that meant everything. He didn't need her forgiveness right now. What he needed was for her to know that he was there. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," Nathan said softly, his voice steady. "But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, Isabella. I just want to show you that I can be who you need me to be. I won't give up." Isabella looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before finally nodding. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was something. And in that moment, Nathan knew that maybe, just maybe, they could begin to rebuild, not as they were, but as they could be. Not as the people they had been, but as the people they were becoming.